so today we're talking about multi-faith, and I want to contextualize it again in integral theory. And this symbol here, which I really love, it took years to finally develop something that encapsulated 40 books by Ken Wilber, all in a simple thing. And it's all there. So, one of the things we look at is a premise of integral theory is that there are four irreducible components of reality. Remember, he's writing a theory of everything. So there's four irreducible components. My interior personal experience, what it means to be me. That's this upper left-hand quadrant here. Our stories and relationships, our culture, the great myths that hold us together, tell us about the world. That's where we're going to go tonight. The objective part of our world, like our brains and our bodies and our physical minds and the physical universe, that get looked at in very particular ways through the eyes of empirical science. And then, how all of those things that we see fit together. All of these are deeply related, but none of them can be reduced to the other. This is extremely important because our scientific community wants to reduce all of our interior personal experiences to neurons firing. And the New Age community wants to reduce all of the neurons firing in our physical brains to what? Spirit. No, that would be over here. They want to reduce it to spirit, to whatever, okay? And reducing it to either side is a fundamental mistake according to integral theory. So we want to hold these as really viable realms that are deeply interconnected, but have their own logic and their own dynamics. All right. So we take away three of those. Like everything, the core of integral is evolution or development. And just as you and I develop through different stages personally, so do our culture's stories develop. And I'm going to talk about those different stages of development that a culture goes through. It's going to look like they're distinct, but they are not in any way. They ebb and they flow. The genius of this came out of Gene Gebser, who looked back at history, looked back at the philosophy over history and said, oh, wait a minute. There are characteristics that we can identify that seem to flow from one or the other. But nothing in the real world is as distinct as I will portray it now. So keep in mind that these are really ebbing and flowing. All right, so kind of at the most simple level is a world of magical beliefs. A tribal orientation. Not a tribal orientation like the tribe we know today. This is a very modern tribe. But literally magical consciousness and a tribal orientation that believes fully and completely that God lives in that volcano, and if I don't sacrifice virgins over here, he'll get pissed and he'll kill us. It's not a superstition. It's entirely believed. Okay? It's a very narrow perspective. The people that I know are my kin, and everybody else is foreigners. It's simultaneously a very magical story and a terrifying story because it's very vulnerable. So that's kind of the tribal cultural story. Everything is alive, everything is wonderful, and everything is terrifying. So it's a very tenuous kind of story. The story that moves from that and supersedes it is called mythic or mythic literal. In the transition, those tribal stories get solidified, they become enlarged, and they are taken literally, as being literally true. And in the West, probably the clearest example we have is fundamentalist Christianity, which says that every single word in the Bible is literally true. It was given by God, and this is the way it is. And then when something happens like Hurricane Sandy, as Pat Robertson or whoever it is, will say, see, that's God punishing whatever place this is because there are gays there, because it says it in the Bible. Okay? Or the movie, the books Left Behind, very literal. There will be a rapture. This is because this is how it is said. Okay? And that's a whole worldview that tells us who we are. Let me interrupt myself for a second here, because the reason these matter so much is it seems like what humans do, our job here perhaps on earth, is to develop a sense of self. I mean, if we evolve enough, maybe we evolve out of that sense of self. But most of our life is creating an identity and a sense of self. But we always do that within a context. And the context is our culture's stories. Gee, I just beat this guy that didn't look like me to death. Does my culture say that's okay? Well, in a tribal or mythic culture, they're allowed to say yes. Okay. Oh yeah, that's who I am. I beat strangers to death. Okay, that works. That's fine. So, we each develop our own personal identity within the context of our cultural myths. All right. The next move is tradition. This is much more common in our world now. It is the world of laws, of rules, of roles that we all play. The Presbyterians call themselves the people of the book. They're very clear about what they are oriented to. There is a body of knowledge, there is an orientation in the world, and I find my role within these sets of rules. Very, very important. A huge advance from the warlord stuff that would happen with mythic consciousness, that happens with ISIS and their whole story, to a rule of law and justice and organization. The traditional stories gets the train here on time. Feel free to interrupt me. All right. Emerging out of traditional stories are the modern stories. And this is the destination of Western society. This is what we seek to do, is become modern. And the story shifts from being, in the traditional sense, it was very communal, especially built around family. The modern mythos becomes all about the individual, about personal aspiration, about competition, about achievement, moving ahead. And our story says, those of you who are most successful are the best. He who dies with the most toys wins. Okay? Is the motto of the modern myth. Very deeply tied to science, reason, rationality. We probably know that story better than, but I was going to say we know it better than any other story, but we're so awash in it, we may not know it at all because it's hard to see it. It's so close to us. This is what we're Postmodern really gained some traction among most of us in the 60s. It had always been around as kind of a possibility, but the 60s really had enough of a critical mass to bring it to fruition in this country and in the West in general. And the focus there is much more on community, on relationships. The sacred comes back in a way. It opens to a world that says more things are possible. We can see more clearly. We open up to possibilities that we had shut off before. We rebel against the rationality of modernity and say, oh, all these possibilities emerge for us. One of the things it does in that opening is it will often dip down into the tribal stories and bring them in without any critical reflection at all. So it's an it becomes this really fascinating mix. I think the archetype of that move is probably the Marvel Comics movies now, where magic and all this stuff is just accepted right out, and all the fantasy stuff that happens with all this, that's post-modernity kind of going, yeah, we just love it. And often it doesn't differentiate between what's real and what's not real there. So that's kind of where we are in the United States, is between the story of modernity and the story of postmodernity. Postmodernity does wonderful things. The whole notion of let's look at the Earth as a whole living entity. We are spaceship Earth. We are related intrinsically to this world. We are woven into it. All of those beautiful visions, the resurrection of the feminine, all of those come out of postmodernity, out of that story. So those are the two, modern and postmodern, that we tend to be absorbed in, especially in the street culture. And then, as far as we'll go with it, integral myth basically says, and an integral myth is just barely emerging now in the world. Basically says all of these are true, but they're partial. They all have pieces of truth, but they don't have the whole truth. And the demand is to hear and listen deeply into all of these views, to hear what may be true, what's not true, to hold it all, and to bring it together and create something new out of it. It's a huge leap here. Typically, these are all at war with each other. The culture wars are defined by these mythological stories. And the shift to an integral myth, which says, no, these are all interrelated, is hopefully the next step forward. And that's what we're trying to foster here. That's the understanding. All right. Not for the teaching piece. Anything you want to say before I get out of teaching work?
Well, I just continue to be fascinated with this. It's new each time I hear it. It means a little bit more, I pick up a little more pieces, and it's more and more coming together and makes so much sense.
Yeah.
And I also want to put in the word on epigenetics. It's not really just science. It's science and the interweave. You know what you said?
Okay.
So it's almost combining that, because it's saying that we can shape our DNA. So
Oh, you're right. Okay.
yeah.
So that's a really good example. So that's a good example. Epigenetics, and I'm sorry, I was misunderstanding you when I kind of pushed on
That's
it
okay.
before.
I held on to it.
So that would be almost a perfect example of how those two spheres are correlated.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying, you can't collapse what we're talking about in terms of epigenetics into one or the other.
Right. Yeah.